Hi YouTube, sorry for the gloomy surroundings, my light bulb's not working very well at the moment. Want to talk about 19th century conservatism this time, following on my previous videos. I'd like to talk about an irony of history. We tend to see 19th century conservatives as largely in the wrong, as holding back the forces of democracy and sometimes capitalism with their policies. We see high Tories, ultra reactionaries, as an embarrassment of history. But a lot of what 19th century conservatives said was proved right by future events. Take the Ottoman Empire and Tsarist Russia. The conservatives there said that any reform would destroy the empires. And they were completely right. Examples of this in the Ottoman Empire, in 1878, one of the first areas to rebel in the Balkans was actually Bosnia, of all places, a Muslim area, because they were losing their privileges under while the empire was being reformed, getting its first ever constitution, first ever parliament. So you'd have thought that would be wonderful for them, but no, they hated it, losing their privileges. And 30 years later, 1908, the Young Turks take over. They introduce democracy to Turkey for the first time. What happens? Greece grabs Crete. Bulgaria declares independence. Austro-Hungary annexes Bosnia and Herzegovina. Disaster. 3 years later, Libya and the Dodecanese are conquered by Italy. 1912, Macedonia is lost to the Balkan League. 2 years later, the Young Turks decided to join the First World War. God knows why. They'd been given very generous terms by Britain for staying neutral. They'd even be allowed to keep Egypt, but no, they decided to side with Germany, and look what happened. The empire was destroyed. So that's the record of Turkey's 15 years of democracy, and of course, this also increased the ferocity of the Turkish state, but we'll go into that later. Now take Russia. Same thing. All reforms launched by Alexander II in the 1860s were disastrous for the Tsarist state. They introduced conscription, which meant several peasants would be taken rather than just one or two, and they'd be taken for just 7 years rather than 25 years as in the past, which meant it was no longer a death sentence to be in the army. And peasant soldiers would return to the village. They would radicalize the other things because they had seen the outside world. They were better educated, more proletarian. The army is the most proletarian organization you can get. And also, the elders of the village had maintained their conservative stranglehold on villages by using conscription as a threat, and so had the Tsarist government. All gone after that. The army was peasantized and the peasants were militarized. And there were judicial reforms to ensure that the judiciary was independent of the state. Once again, a disaster. It allowed the radical intelligentsia, the socialists and anarchists, to get away with murder. And they were able to use these newly freed courts as platforms for their propaganda. Brilliant. And then in 1861, the biggest reform of all, the emancipation of the serfs, despite all the generous redemption payments that had to be made to the nobles, was a disaster for them. The peasant uprising in 1917, where the estates were seized, was just the culmination of a very long, painful decline of the Russian upper class. Once they had lost their guaranteed workforce, the serfs, they had to actually bid for workers. And they often found they couldn't manage their own estate, so they rented most of them out. And in fact, by 1914, almost half the noble lands they'd owned in when the serfs were emancipated had fallen into peasant and capitalist hands. As I said in one of my earlier videos, upper classes wouldn't exist without state support. They're an artificial class. And in Britain, we had an ultra-conservative movement in the early 1830s, the High Tories. 1832 was when we had the first extension of the vote since about 4 centuries. Until then, only landowners could vote. 1832, about half of the male middle class are given the vote. It wasn't particularly radical. They still didn't have secret ballots. They still MPs still had to be nobles and weren't paid anything, so the upper class still had a pretty good stranglehold. And yet it was the Great Reform Act was seen as incredibly radical by High Tories. They thought it was a betrayal of the Constitution, and they said it wouldn't end there. The Whigs at the time were saying this is just to save the country from revolution. We won't be making any more changes or any more extensions of the vote. But the High Tories were proved right. It did lead to more extensions. They also realised correctly that the establishment of democracy would create tyranny of the majority with higher taxes. They were proved right again. Now, I'm not defending ultra-conservatives of the 19th century. I'm just saying they shouldn't be dismissed by modern historians because a lot of what they said was frighteningly accurate. See you later, YouTube. Bye-bye.